Susan Woods is about to give a talk on the state of the questions 40 years after the Second Vatican Council. And just her biography here, Susan K. Wood is a Sister of Charity of Leavenworth, Kansas. She received her PhD in systematic theology from Marquette University. She serves on the USA Lutheran Roman Catholic Dialogue and has participated in consultations on baptism, theological anthropology, and the nature and purpose of ecumenical dialogue sponsored by Faith and Order of the World Council of Churches and the Joint Working Group. She is Professor of Theology and Associate Dean for the School of Theology Seminary, St. John's University in Collegeville, Minnesota. And she has published Spiritual Exegesis and the Church in the Theology of Henri de Lubac and Sacramental Orders. And again, she'll be speaking for about 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions, clarification, and discussion. So it's great pleasure I can introduce to you today Susan K. Wood.
I must begin with an apology that I didn't get the paper here until last night. I just moved to Milwaukee 3 weeks ago, where I will take a position at Marquette University next year, and I've totally underestimated what that means in terms of moving. But I'm very happy to be with you today. Well, 40 years after the Council, we have lots of books on the priesthood. We have widespread acknowledgement that there is a crisis in priestly identity. There is an undisputable shortage, but I should maybe say that might be disputable according to Dean Hoge. But at any rate, especially in the Midwest and West, an undisputable shortage of priests. And lay ecclesial ministers are minding the store in the absence of resident pastors. We have lots of men and women who are in this burgeoning growth of lay ministry. Some of them have very fine education. Some of them have almost no education for what they're doing. The emergence of this lay ministry has led to some rich collaboration and diversification within ministry, but at times it has resulted in what I call defensive driving on the part of the ordained. My task today is an almost impossible one. It's to lay out the state of the question regarding a theology of ministry with special emphasis on the priesthood, but not to exclude the laity. And I will do so by identifying the major themes, developments, and tensions within this theology. Now, my first principle in terms of the state of the question is that a theology of ministry does not develop in a vacuum within an ivory tower of speculation or behind closed doors of ecclesiastical offices. A theology of ministry is always influenced by the cultural and historical context in which it is situated. It is always contextual, which means that we cannot arrive at a theology of priesthood or of lay ecclesial ministry once and for all. Such a theology is in dialogue with the theology that preceded it and with pastoral needs that confront it. It is organic, dynamic, adaptive, characterized by both continuity and change. So, in order to talk about what's happened 40 years after the Council, I have to begin with the major contributions of Vatican II, and at least treat those very briefly. Because what's happened since the Council has been in direct dialogue with that theology as well as with the cultural and historical context since then. A major achievement of the Vatican II was the development of a theology of the episcopacy, but it did not achieve the same for the presbyterate. The decree on the training of priests addressed the fostering of priestly vocations and the principles and regulations for priestly training. The decree on ministry and life of priests initiates a theology of the presbyterate, but much more development is needed. And Lumen Gentium, as you know, had only one section on the presbyterate. The general emphasis at the time of the council, as Daniel Donovan has noted, has indicated that at that time the emphasis was on priestly ministry before priestly life or priestly identity. The bishops at Vatican II broadened the theology of the priesthood from its Tridentine forerunner, which was predominantly occultic and priestly theology with an emphasis on the priest's role in the Eucharist. Vatican II expanded that through its use of the threefold office of priest, prophet, and king, corresponding to the sanctifying, teaching, and pastoral leadership duties of a priest. And it particularly identified preaching the gospel as the preeminent responsibility of a bishop and, by extension, a presbyter. The council identified the presbyterate with reference to the episcopacy and identified it as a communal ministry. Now, subsequent to Vatican II, there's been some discussion of these threefold offices, and theologians are generally agreeing and saying that they don't exhaust a theology of the priesthood, and they're more unified and interrelated than what the council documents might suggest. But the use of that by the council broke down a distinction between sacramental and ecclesiastical jurisdiction by situating governance and pastoral leadership within the sacrament of order. Okay, I have to abbreviate some of what's happening, and then we're going to expand it for publication. So I will just move on from Vatican II. But I will make one comment in that immediately on the heels of the council, the context, of course, was the late 60s, the cultural upheaval of those years, the exodus from the ministerial priesthood, and then the subsequent, what I would call, narrowing of priestly identity in practice as priests took on the pastorship of multiple parishes. This had the effect of restricting priest activity to the sacraments. So whereas the theology of the council expanded it through the use of the threefold office, what we had in practical experience was a contraction of identity because of the context. Now, Archbishop Pilarczyk has said that there are three churches in the United States: East Coast, Midwest, and West Coast. I'm aware that I'm speaking on the East Coast. I'm so Midwestern, I squeak. So I would say I don't know, I would suspect that the impact of that has been least on the East Coast and greatest in the Midwest and the West. But that's part of the context of all of this, too. Okay, so in jumping forward to kind of a post-Vatican II look, the literature on priesthood after Vatican II belongs to two different genres. One are ecclesiastical documents that come out from the Congregation for the Clergy, John Paul II's encyclical Pastoris Dabo Vobis, and then the Ministerial Priesthood, which came out in 1971. And then there's all these books written by theologians. Now, it would be an impossible task to survey all the theological documents, so what I'd like to do is give you the direction of the ecclesiastical documents, and then instead of going through individual theologians, to jump to theological themes and tensions, that are present across a number of theologians. Now, the first major document on the priesthood after the council was the Ministerial Priesthood, the document from the 1971 Synod. The document is contextualized within the post-conciliar period on the heels of the social unrest of the late 60s, and then new contextual situations cited in the document include the problem of obsolete methods insufficient for the modern mentality, those are the words of the document, the secularization of the world, whether the emphasis of the Council on the proclamation of the gospel raises doubts about the meaning of a sacramental and cultic ministry. So here you have the first reaction to proclamation and gospel, is a reinforcement of sacramental and cultic. The growing diversification of ministry, and whether the teaching on the common priesthood of the faithful obscures the position of the priestly ministry. And this is going to be the neuralgic question, I believe, after Vatican II. Okay, again, to jump to the chase on this, the general direction of the document is to affirm the priestly identity of the presbyter, to emphasize what distinguishes a ministerial priest from the common priesthood. And where the Vatican II documents emphasize the ministry of priests, this document focuses on the way of life of priests in its warnings concerning secular and political activity, the fairly extensive section on celibacy, its treatment of the community life among priests, and the modest lifestyle fitting to their status of life. So again, the movement was to reaffirm difference from the laity, to move from ministry to cultic, and from ministry to lifestyle. The next, or another, I should say, it's not next because I have these out of order for a reason. A second post-conciliar document was issued in 1999 by the Congregation for Clergy, the Priests in the Third Christian Millennium, Teacher of Word, Minister of the Sacraments, and Leader of the Community. Notice it picks up the threefold office. Again, it contextualizes the priesthood in terms of increasing secularism, dangers of relativism, and the major theme of this document is re-evangelization and what is necessary for the priesthood in order to engage in this re-evangelization. It emphasizes holiness of life and profound and proper training in philosophy and theology. Although it integrates priestly life and ministry, in its insistence that proclamation of the word is related to the personal prayer and sacramental life of the priest, it's also careful to distinguish him from the lay faithful. In fact, I think it's very significant because it states that since priests participate in the authority of Christ, they differ notably from the faithful. So the difference is one of authority here. An expansion, I believe, of the idea of a priest acting in persona Christi Capitis, which has a liturgical context, and it extends this liturgical role into governance. Now, while episcopal authority has been a frequent theme in documents, priestly authority has been addressed much less often. And this theme also occurs in this document's admonition that objective spiritual authority must be complemented with a subjective authority deriving from sincerity and holiness of life in pastoral charity. It is also concerned with giving an apologetic for the priesthood, as is indicated in the section title, The Necessary and Indispensable Role of Priests. It's like where somebody's going to be afraid they are no longer indispensable. And I would also note that the pastoral ministry of priests in this document is directed towards the care of souls, the care of individuals, rather than the church as a community. Okay, a third major document after the Council is John Paul II's post-synodal apostolic exhortation, I Will Give You Shepherds. I think on the whole, this document is rather balanced. He balances ministry and life of priests. It mentions the crisis of priestly identity. And its response to this crisis is to stress the specific ontological bond which unites the priesthood to Christ, the high priest and good shepherd. And for John Paul II, the priesthood is essentially understood in reference to Christ. And the role of the priest is to prolong the presence of Christ. That's a direct quote. However, he also notes the fundamental relational and communal nature of the priesthood and says that reference to the church is therefore necessary, even if it is not primary, in defining the identity of the priest, and notes that the ecclesiology of communion is decisive for understanding the priest's identity. He will say that referencing the priesthood to Christ is not prior to the church, nor is it posterior to the church. So he's caught in this tension of the question of whether a priest first represents Christ and secondly the church, or first the church and through the church Christ. This is going to be one of the themes of tension. This tension is very evident in this document, and it's very evident that John Paul II is trying to come down somewhere in the middle and not take an extreme position on either end. The survey of ecclesiastical documents demonstrates that the emphasis since Vatican II has been to shore up priestly identity by emphasizing the difference between the common priesthood and the ministerial priesthood, by emphasizing the cultic nature of priesthood, by stressing the priest's configuration to Christ, and by stressing the state of life of the priest. Discussions of priestly ministry treat his sacramental ministry and pastoral care of individuals. More communal and ecclesial themes within pastoral leadership rarely occur. Okay, that's the survey of the ecclesiastical documents. So I'm into part 2, which are the theological themes in tension. The first of these is the difference in essence between the common and ministerial priesthoods, which is from Lumen Gentium 10. Vatican II identified the Christian faithful as a priestly people in Chapter 2 of Lumen Gentium before it addressed the hierarchical priesthood in Chapter 3. This situates the ordained priesthood in relationship to the common priesthood. The ordained priesthood exists to foster and nourish the common priesthood. However, the relationship between the ministerial priesthood and the common priesthood has been one of the most neuralgic topics since Vatican II, and perhaps the most often quoted line from Chapter 2 is, though they differ from one another in essence, and not only in degree, the common priesthood of the faithful and the ministerial or hierarchical priesthoods are nonetheless interrelated. Just a few minutes ago, I was talking with a few colleagues out in the hallway, and we've all read the draft documents on lay ecclesial ministries that the bishops are considering. And when the last draft that passed through my hand, I actually did a word search on it to see how many times they quoted this particular line from Vatican II. And that's what I call defensive driving. Is that this, how many times do we have to insist on an essential difference? Now, this statement is actually subject to two different interpretations, one more positive, one more negative. The positive interpretation of this statement is that the two priesthoods, because they are not a matter of degree, the ministerial priesthood cannot be interpreted as being higher and a priest being a super Christian. It's not a hierarchy of holiness or of degrees of being Christian. But the ministerial priesthood is of an entirely different order and cannot be located on a scale of holiness with respect to the common priesthood. However, the negative interpretation is that in relationship to a theology of lay ecclesial ministry, the phrase occurs to distance the ordained priesthood from the common priesthood, lest the latter exceed its competencies. The fear is a blurring of the two priesthoods and an attenuation of the ordained priesthood. This accompanies another fear that the priesthood will be considered as a delegation of the common priesthood along democratic or congregationalist lines, where a local church may feel itself empowered to ordain its own minister on the basis of its common priesthood. The distinction between the two priesthoods is further emphasized by liturgical regulations such as Redemptionis Sacramentum, emphasizing the distinction between the nave of the church and the sanctuary, and the movements of the non-ordained in the sanctuary and their handling of sacred vessels. David Power has identified three difficulties with this distinction. First, it rests on too sharp a distinction between the priesthood and the kingship of Christ. Second, it gives priority to the nature of the church as institution with its different offices, while these are simply meant to support the life of community as a body. And third, it seems to support a distinction between spiritual sacrifice and priesthood and sacramental sacrifice and priesthood. Power suggests that institutions and roles, though necessary, be understood as relations and responsibilities within the context of the Eucharistic and eschatological community, rather than in terms of power and office. This relational view would situate the priesthood more firmly in the context of Christian community and move more in the direction of a relational ontology, thus avoiding the dichotomy between a functional and ontological view of the priesthood. Okay, the second tension is the difference between the ministerial priesthood viewed as functional or ontological. Current debates of priestly identity often split along more liberal lines, espousing a functional view of priestly ministry, and more conservative interpretations emphasizing an ontological change effected by the sacramental character of ordination. A functional view presupposes that the priest is merely exercising a ministry derived from the common priesthood, which essentially any of the baptized could perform. A theology of ontological difference emphasizes the distinction between the ordained priesthood and the laity. I believe that the choice between the two views is ultimately a false choice, because function follows being, and being results in a corresponding function. The deeper theological question is to identify what the sacramental character actually affects. A review of the literature reveals a spectrum of views, from conformity of the priest to Christ, empowering him to confect the Eucharist, to a more ecclesial interpretation, according to which a new ecclesial relationship, referred to as ecclesial repositioning, is effected and interpreted as a relational ontology. Within this latter interpretation, sacramental power is not conferred on an individual apart from this ecclesial relationship, but the individual is empowered to act sacramentally because of that person's reconfiguration in a new ecclesial relationship, which enables the priest to act in persona Christi Capitis. Okay, a third tension. A third major tension is whether the priest represents the church secondarily through his primary representation of Christ, or whether he represents Christ mediately through his representation of the church. From the 12th century, largely through the instrumental causality developed by the scholastic theologians, we have inherited the theology of the priest as representative of Christ, consecrating the Eucharist through his word spoken in persona Christi. Yves Congar notes that this theology became what he called isolated, hardened, and material. Furthermore, this theology is in danger of isolating the priest's identity and sacramental action from the identity and action of the Church. And in fact, it was in teaching the Trinity last semester, and I was reading, this is from I Believe in the Holy Spirit. Probably few people pick up I believe in the Holy Spirit as a source of theology of the priesthood. But in this, I found the best explication of the relationship of in persona Christi, in persona ecclesiae that I've read. So I'll cite him for a bit here. The true perspective of the in persona Christi is sacramental. The priest who celebrates the Church's act of worship is himself a sacramental reality. That is to say, he represents, at the level of what can be seen, a spiritual reality. He is that reality in accordance with that fullness that is realized by the Church's worship. And the fullness is defined, for example, in the papal encyclical Mediator Dei of 1947 and in Sacrosanctum Concilium of Vatican II as the full public worship performed by the mystical body of Jesus Christ, that is, by head and members. And it's in accordance with this organic reality, with its two aspects, that the priest represents Christ. He represents not only Christ, the sovereign high priest, but also the ecclesia, the community of Christians, in whose person he acts also. So he acts both in persona Christi and in persona ecclesiae. One is contained within the other. So therefore, it's an organic interrelation, not a choice of either or of which comes first and which comes second. An insistence on the Christological aspect, and this is what's occurred in the West, means that the in persona ecclesiae is situated within the in persona Christi, which is seen as the basis and reason for the first. And I would say that Mediator Dei and John Paul II, Pastoris Dabo Vobis, follows that line of thinking. If, on the other hand, the pneumatological aspect is emphasized, as the Eastern tradition loves to do, the in persona Christi is more easily seen within the in persona ecclesiae. I also think this is the Augustinian view, even though Augustine's from the West, in that he emphasizes the Church as the totus Christus. And so the totus Christus is never divorced from the Christus. The East, as well as the West, which would mean the pneumatological as well as the Christological, affirms that the priest receives the power to consecrate the Eucharist. But the nuance within the pneumatological interpretation is that he does not do so by virtue of a power which remains within his control, but by a grace for which he asks God and which is operative and even ensured through him in the Church. And it's significant that if we do an analysis of the Eucharistic prayer is prayed in the first person plural. The epiclesis is invoked in the first person plural. So it's the priest saying those words, using the we of the assembly in the context of the Church, and it's only the words of institution which are spoken in first person singular. And I believe John Baldwin has more to say about that. Okay, the fourth area of tension then, which is related to this, is the relationship between Christology and pneumatology in a theology of priesthood. And it's related, so I won't rehearse all that, but just to say that there are 4 Eucharistic prayers without an institution narrative that have been approved by the Church as valid Eucharists. And so that fact, as John Baldwin will be saying, means that we perhaps need to give more emphasis to a theology of epiclesis and the role of priesthood within that the Eucharistic prayer than we have in the past. Okay, to move on to lay ecclesial ministry, although it's not the primary focus of this presentation, I was asked to briefly include it. First, the term ministry was commonly applied to the laity only after Vatican II. The term the Council used was lay apostolate, and this referred to lay activity for mission that was derived from baptism and confirmation, belonging properly to the laity and no longer interpreted as a participation in the apostolate of the ordained. The term ministry is now widely used to apply to the laity, although the Vatican document, Instruction on Some Aspects of the Collaboration of the Lay Faithful with the Ministry of Priests, has tried to put Pandora back in her box. The use of ministry as applied to the laity seems particularly apt for public authorized service performed by laity in the name of the Church. However, the term has become so common that it and what it represents is in danger of being confused with the concept and fact of Christian discipleship, to which all Christians are called, while only some are called to ministry. Second, a certain tension exists in the documents of Vatican II, which assign the realm of the sacred to those in ordained ministry and the secular dimension to the laity. This dichotomy between the sacred and secular is not helpful, particularly when one understands the Church's mission to be essentially secular, that is, the transformation of the world according to the reign of God. The very term lay ecclesial points to this dichotomy of sacred and secular. A theological challenge requiring attention is to differentiate between lay ecclesial ministry and ordained ministry, to address the question, if you will, of where the essential difference mentioned by Vatican II lies. Functional answers along a division of labor in answers of power or office remain inadequate in and of themselves. So what are some future directions? Very briefly, the Collegeville Ministry Seminar, whose work was promulgated in the book I edited, Ordering the Baptismal Priesthood, suggests that instead of speaking of lay ecclesial ministry, that we use the term ordered ministries, referring to the ministry itself rather than the minister. Ministry actually occurs on a continuum marked by whether one enters it through ordination, installation, or commissioning, by how stable it is, how fundamentally vocational it is in orienting the whole of the life of the minister, and by the formation and preparation required. However, it is not likely that this suggestion of our group of 10 theologians will be adopted anytime soon. However, I do think it's a viable one solution. At different levels, both ecclesial lay ministry and ordained ministry are representative of Christ in the Church. They can be distinguished from one another, however, by whether they represent and serve ecclesial communion at the level of parish, particular church, or universal church, and by whether they have the responsibility of representing and serving the apostolicity of the Church, either through participation in the Episcopal College and through apostolic succession in the case of bishops, or by their relationship to the bishop in the case of presbyter and deacon. I really think this is one area that needs much more discussion. I think the difference is not going to be functional. I think we can even get into trouble if we push representational too far. But I think one of the things that ordination, deacons traditionally, are directly related to the bishop. was the bishop's right hand, literally man, administering the goods of the church. The priest is seen almost an extension of the episcopacy, although I know there are some theologians currently writing books saying that Vatican II went too far in not distinguishing adequately enough, but or identifying adequately enough the autonomy of the priest with regard to a bishop. But I think if we look at the difference between sacramental and non-sacramental ordered ministries, apostolicity is going to be a major distinction. At the representational level, lay ministers can have to, at some level, be seen as representing the church. If they go out, because they're delegated by the church to somehow act for the church. I mean, we can't say that they're not. But on the other hand, they don't represent the full communion of a specific level of ecclesiality in the same way that an ordained minister does. And here the paradigm is the parochial paradigm adopted by Vatican II, which is parish, diocese, particular church, or universal church. Round 10 of the U.S. Lutheran Roman Catholic Dialogue, completed in April 2004, is an example of a theology that ties a theology of ministry to a theology of church's communion. And that's available on the USCCB website and is in published form. Official magisterial documents on the priesthood still propose essentialist theologies of the priesthood, which are universal for all priests in all places. I believe that a more contextualized theology of the priesthood is needed. This will necessarily account for parochial and non-parochial priestly ministries, as well as give an account of priesthood within religious communities, an area in which there has been insufficient theological reflection. One notable exception being O'Malley's work on this. In emphasizing a priest's relationship to Christ, it is essential that this not detract from every Christian's resemblance to Christ in baptism, or that an emphasis on the cultic and sacramental role of the priest in promoting the holiness of the church not be divorced from his work within the church as a community in building up the church as the body of Christ, the people of God, and temple of the Spirit. As the Council insisted in Chapter 2 of Lumen Gentium, we are saved not as an individual, but as a people, and has our priestly ministry attended to that communal dimension. Finally, in the West, we would do well to balance the overwhelmingly Christological emphasis in the theology of the priesthood by a more robust theology of the Holy Spirit. This would necessarily place a theology of the priesthood firmly within the church and the priest in solidarity with the rest of the people of God.